Fortnite Chapter 6 Season 1 has completely revamped the map with a whole new set of POIs, and today we're going to break them all down. From towering landmarks to hidden gems, I'll be ranking each POI based on how fun they are to drop into, how good the loot is, and how they shake up the gameplay. So grab your gliders and let's jump right into the rankings to see which POI takes the top spot this season. And just to preface, this is probably the first season I've ever played where there isn't a POI that I don't like. I think part of the reason is due to how beautiful the map is, thanks to the amazing lighting and graphics that Unreal Engine 5 provides, as well as the Japanese theme they have going on. It's literally a recipe for success, so with that being said, let's get started. Going from worst to best, I have to rate Bird as the worst POI. Yes, of course it's a meme, but that's all it is. Look, I'll give it credit to giving me some sort of nostalgic feel that's reminiscent of Greasy Grove with how the interior of the gas station feels, but there really isn't a whole lot going for it, other than the ability to fuel up for a few seconds in the midst of driving away from a cracked Fortnite baby with a Typhoon blade. The only other POI I have in the F tier is Shining Span. Again, there's not a POI I don't like, but compared to the others, I have to place it here. Admittedly, this is probably the coolest bridge we've ever gotten in Fortnite, but that's pretty much the only good thing going for it. Any bridge in Fortnite isn't somewhere where I'd want to land, much less stop at to loot. Although there's a few vehicles you could use for cover, it's still just a giant open area where you could easily be spotted and ambushed. I do like how there's an undercarriage to it you can loot, but in the grand scheme of things, there's much better POIs to land at to set yourself up for a better game, and you should just use a bridge for what it's intended for: connectivity and transportation. Coming up in the D tier is Brutal Boxcars. This POI is just lackluster in all areas. It's not very visually pleasing, there's not many chests that spawn, and there's little to no floor loot. Not to mention, if you were to rotate to the closest POI, which is Lost Lake, you'd be extremely vulnerable going there, assuming you probably didn't get the best loot. And seeing as how there's a giant mountain to the southeast of this POI, there really aren't many good places to rotate other than Lost Lake. Comparatively speaking, there are just much better landing spots. First up in the C tier is Warrior's Watch. It's not exactly a hot landing zone, but you'll inevitably end up landing with at least a few other players. Due to how small the POI is, you're going to have to scramble upon landing to quickly grab a gun, and then traverse the tower without disorienting yourself to kill anyone else who landed there. If you're fortunate enough to be the last one, you'll probably find yourself leaving with good loot due to its decent chest and floor loot spawns. It's a high-risk, high-reward landing zone. In my opinion, the two most neighboring POIs, Night Shift Forest and Foxy Floodgates, are much safer and better options. The next POI that belongs in the C tier is Flooded Frogs. Although it has a cool Japanese theme, there are multiple other locations with a similar style that are just even better aesthetically and more memorable. Fortunately, this is not a hot landing spot, so you may find yourself only combated against a couple enemies, or even none if you're lucky. Even still, there's not too much to loot, and you may have to travel to the other POIs until you're satisfied with your loadout, so it's unfortunate that it is pretty secluded and far from any other notable looting areas. Last up in the C tier is Wythe Warf. If it wasn't so secluded, I would put it in B tier. Some might say seclusion can be a strategic move in Fortnite, and although that may be true, I often find myself gravitating towards other more memorable and bigger locations. It's a very unique POI with a ton of loot to grab. Despite it being remote, anytime I've landed here, I've always landed with a few others and have had to fight my way around the area. That being said, it's really not a bad landing spot, it just gets overshadowed. First up in the B tier is Canyon Crossing. I'm torn on this one. Objectively, it's a cool area with a ton of buildings and areas to loot. It's usually not ever heavily contested as well. The biggest thing holding it back though, is its location. Considering how much of a hotspot that Shogun Solitude is and the topography of surrounding areas, Canyon Crossing finds itself being the very first rotation amongst anyone landing there. So if you land at Canyon and end up staying a minute too long, you'll find yourself being ambushed by rotating players. At surface level, it's a safe landing spot, but you better rotate out of there punctually. Next up in the B tier is Hopeful Heights. I always have a soft spot for residential POIs. Although it's fairly secluded, you can almost guarantee that at least one mini-boss will spawn near its location. The area also has plenty of buildings to loot. It's a moderately congested landing spot, so just make sure you land away from others, and you can usually loot a few houses fairly quickly before rotating to either a mini-boss or to Masked Meadows. Another reason I like this POI so much is because it reminds me of Hazy Hillside from Chapter 5 Season 1. Rest in peace, Hazy. You were gone too soon. Coming next in the B tier is Masked Meadows. Is this not Pleasant Park, Okinawa edition, or what? Just a beautiful town full of tons of homes, loot, and aesthetics. Considering how big the town is, I usually don't find too many people landing here, making it a somewhat safe and comfortable place for me to land. This is usually my go-to if I'm not trying to hot drop or land somewhere super congested. Just a real solid landing spot. The next POI being ranked in B tier is Twinkle Terrace. This is probably the most underrated POI on the map. Although it's not the biggest, it's incredibly dense and gives off a Chinatown vibe to it. It's not a hot drop by any means, and you're always bound to get some decent loot with all of the chests and floor spawns. Fortunately, you usually don't have to pay much attention to the north considering not too many people land at Wythe. However, the POI is incredibly close to Night Shift Forest, which is a huge danger zone considering all the players fighting to open the vault there. But if you're looking for a somewhat safe landing spot with pretty decent loot, you can't go wrong with Twinkle Terrace. The final POI in the B tier is Pumped Power. Now, I'm not usually a fan of the super industrial looking POIs, prime example being Red Light and Rig from Chapter 5, but Pumped Power just checks most of the boxes. It's big, there's tons of loot, it's a relatively safe landing zone, and you're bound to walk out of there at least semi-comfortably with a decent loadout. Not to mention, the location of it is great. It's not right in the middle of the map, but it's also not insanely secluded. Plus, if you can loot fast enough, you can potentially rotate out to Demon's Dojo and third party whoever defeats the boss, or you may even be quick enough to defeat the boss yourself. All in all, a solid POI that you should quit sleeping on. The first POI being ranked in A tier is Lost Lake. Its location on the map is amazing, and you'll never find yourself having to travel far for Storm. I also love all the water and theme of the POI. Not to mention, the abundance of little jungle huts and buildings to loot is enticing, mixed with a chance of a boss spawning there. It's a pretty hot landing zone, so just be wary of where others are landing so you don't get too pumped by the lucky rascal who landed before you and found a purple sentinel. Next up in the A tier is Magic Mosses. Magic Mosses to me is like a better version of the Chapter 4 Season 3 jungle area. It's mysterious, it completely envelops you upon landing, and the little villages you find just give off a cool vibe. It's a super large POI, but there's not a lot of focal points there. So if you go to land in Magic Mosses and aim for one of the villages, chances are you'll be landing with at least one other. So prepare yourself for a little forest duel. I also love the little underground cavern that's in the middle of one of the villages. I found it by chance one game and thought it was a neat touch. Also, its location is amazing. You're nestled between Pumped Power, Flooded Frogs, and Lost Lake, which are all great POIs to rotate to. You honestly can't go wrong landing here. Next up in the A tier is Foxy Floodgate. Okay, this place is sick. You have the upper portion of the POI, which is a huge dam that mostly acts as a means for transportation. And then you have the bottom portion of the dam, which is a big area with so much floor loot and a lot of chests. The verticality here is insane, and there's so many ways to get inside the dam. There's been a countless number of games where I've landed at Foxy and fought there the entire game until the final few circles. Mostly being due to it being a pretty hot landing zone, and also because it's a centralized POI on the map, so naturally players tend to rotate there throughout the whole game. It's just a blast landing there because you'll always have a unique encounter with all the verticality involved. The next POI in the A tier is Demon's Dojo. The boss arena here is so cool, but I hate how Epic nerfed the fight because I actually enjoyed it more when it took longer to stagger the demon head. And with Demon's Dojo very clearly being an area on the map meant to attract players to land there and grab the medallion, it really helps spread out where players land rather than the majority landing in a centralized POI on the map. The aesthetic of it is also super dope, but now that Epic added more snow to the map for the winter season, it made it a little less unique. But that being said, you'll find plenty of loot in the houses and have plenty of action having to defend against the boss's phantoms while simultaneously fighting the other 10 people who landed there. But the risk is well worth the reward because if you're the last person standing, you get to kill the boss and take the Night Rose's medallion, which constantly reloads your weapon while it's equipped. Last up in the A tier before we move on to the best 2 POIs in the season is Seaport City. Seaport City is seriously a gem. Although it's not the biggest town or city POI we've ever seen, it's incredibly dense with all the storefront buildings, the train that cuts through the city, the verticality of the skyscrapers, and the Christmas tree loot that's spread around everywhere. But fair warning, you're bound to see a ton of people landing here due to all the winter investigation quests that require you to speak with Noir on the top floor of the tallest building. The vibe of this POI just reminds me of Mega City from Chapter 4, and it's executed so well as a contrast to all the Japanese themed POIs on the map. The only bad thing about landing here is that there's not really any POIs near it, but you won't even need any because you'll have no problem getting a good loadout if you're able to escape in one piece. First up in S tier is Shogun Solitude. This was the first POI I landed at in Chapter 6, and that's because of how much it captivated me seeing it from the battle bus. It just completely stands out from any other area on the map due to its red grass and trees, as well as its much higher elevation compared to its surroundings. One really good thing about landing here is that it's highly unlikely for anyone to rotate here due to it being pretty remote, as well as due to the elevation of it. However, with that being said, it's an extremely popular POI and you'll always find yourself landing with a plethora of other players. So just make sure you execute your jump from the bus perfectly so that you can grab a weapon quick and get some quick elimination so you can properly loot the area. You may also have a chance to fight a mini-boss there if it spawns. I can't help but put this in S tier, and I know part of it is just my emotional reasoning to how unique and amazing the visuals of it are. In my opinion, the very best POI of Chapter 6 has to go to Night Shift Forest. I don't think there will be any huge outcry to my decision on this, although I could see how others would disagree with it being the absolute best. I just love everything about it. It's enormous, it stands out with its beautiful purple trees, it's always nighttime when you land, which gives off a cool and mysterious vibe. There's a decent amount of huts and houses to loot, and there's a huge vault here that you can get into by sacrificing a cute little sprite to the bush ranger for him to eat, which also turns the night to daytime and creates an equally beautiful atmosphere. And maybe I've just gotten lucky, but it seems like not as many people have been landing here lately compared to when everyone first found out about the vault. This POI is also in a pretty good spot for storm rotation, making it to where you won't ever have to traverse the entire map for zone. But honestly, all in all, due to the aesthetic, the vault that'll stack your load up as much as you could ever dream of, and its decent location, it's hard to argue that there's many POIs that can compete for the top spot. Again, this is all my humble opinion, and there truly isn't a single place on the Chapter 6 map that I don't enjoy landing at. If you have any concerns with my rankings and think that I'm just downright wrong with my opinions, be sure to enlighten me down in the comments below. Also, be sure to let me know how I did with this video. It took more time and effort than I thought it would, and it was my first time venturing into a true long-form video. Until next time.